Hello there, this is James at ScruffyJames1978, and as the people who've been subscribed to my channel for a long time or know me personally will be well aware, I am a massive fan of Asian cinema, particularly Korean and Japanese tragedies, that since discovering such movies on YouTube back in 2009, they have literally changed my life and the way that I see the world, and as a writer myself, have inspired some of my greatest work. And yet, for the last 2 years or so, while I've taken the time to watch and make videos about some of the films written and directed by Kim Ki-duk, it's only been in the last few days that I've gotten back into the habit of watching Asian movies regularly. Instead, for the past 2 years or so, I've been watching English language movies, including Django Unchained, the Disney films Frozen and Tangled, 12 Years a Slave, Dallas Buyers Club, Red Dragon, Pacific Rim, As Good as It Gets, Up, Coraline, District 9, Les Miserables, The Hudsucker Proxy, and all of the Marvel movies up to and including Avengers Assemble, and watching a recent episode of Extra Credits discussing the uncanny, in inverted commas, in horror, particularly in video games, it occurred to me that in spite of the vast differences between these films and almost every other English language movie I've seen in my life, the overwhelming majority of them share one thing in common: the fact that they are all carefully wrapped up and cushioned to ensure that they have the minimum possible long-term impact upon the audience. And indeed, if we apply what the Extra Credits team is saying in this next clip to all storytelling, not merely horror, understanding that the same basic principle is true in almost all films, TV shows, and what have you, then this is precisely what I'm talking about, and as always, the link to the full video is listed down in the underbar, and I ask everyone to please subscribe to the Extra Credits channel.
How long has it been since somebody created a piece of horror that really stuck with you? One that chilled you to the bone and left you looking behind your shoulder, or made you pause before you turned off the lights at night? It's been some time for me. Most of the horror movies released today just don't really get to me. Even a great film like Cabin in the Woods, it's strong because it's a deconstruction rather than because it offers us a real step into the darkness. And horror games have been trending further and further from that grim reflection of ourselves that we saw in the old Silent Hills or Fatal Frames. Some horror games have drifted toward the action-packed, zombie-stomping power fantasy side of things, experiences which may be intense from moment to moment but certainly don't qualify as true horror. Other horror games, especially recently, have delved into the jump-scare, hide-from-the-monster type of experiences. Games which are very much about terror, but they aren't exactly what I'm talking about either. I'm talking about real psychological horror, the kind that sticks with you long after the experience is over. PT is in many ways masterful, something we should talk about in its own right, but it stands as an exception to the long-standing rule. So what's happened? At first, I thought perhaps it was just that I've grown old, that the terrors of my youth are but fancies in my age. But then I came to the realization, much of modern horror is actually created to make us feel safe. Sure, it'll give us a jump scare here and there, it'll throw in some gruesome imagery, and it'll surprise us or fill us with disgust in the moment, but these feelings are meant to be fleeting. You're intended to leave the theater or put down the game and laugh about how silly you were to jump or to be frightened. You're supposed to feel powerful for not being scared, or for knowing that you can overcome that horror. You're supposed to go joke over coffee about how not scared you were, or snuggle up to a loved one. In general, you're supposed to leave the experience aware of how comfortably safe your real world is. And it's not that this is supposed to happen on a conscious level. Often, only the best creators of this form of horror are even particularly aware they're doing it. But insofar as this form of modern horror works, it works because it leaves you, on some subtle level, feeling safer about the real world we live in, rather than leaving you scared of the possible world it created. Now, there's nothing wrong with this kind of horror. I think it has its place. But it's not what someone like James wants. And he will be the first to admit that perhaps he carries some damage with him. That wanting horror experiences to linger in one's mind long after the experience is over might be kind of weird. But it's what he looks for when he enters into a horror experience. He wants to feel that fear. He wants to know that side of himself.
In the overwhelming majority of non-Asian storytelling, and a great deal of Asian storytelling for that matter, any real emotional impact, trauma, or social critique is limited to the fictional universe itself. That is to say, even if the characters don't live happily ever after, the creators almost always go out of their way to ensure that we don't take what we've just seen personally or carry it with us into the real world, because the primary purpose of the movie or TV show in question is to entertain, to give us anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours of excitement, comedy, romance, horror, or what have you, before we get on with our lives, perhaps talking about it, recommending it, or critiquing it as a work of fiction in itself, but never truly feeling challenged or questioned by it in any genuine sense of the term. To the best of my recollection, in fact, the only two great Hollywood movies I've seen which have ever even attempted to have any kind of genuine long-term influence upon the audience were Seven and Lord of War. However, Lord of War's point was almost entirely political, and walking out of the cinema after watching Seven, although the rest of the audience was numb with shock, the only thing that I heard anyone say about it was that another serial killer film had been funny, while this movie, in contrast, had merely been violent. Way to completely miss the point, lady, and I could spend the next few hours explaining how that statement is wrong on every possible level. However, although it was only a single reaction to a single movie almost 2 decades ago, it does seem to fit the pattern which Hollywood, and by extension most of the rest of the filmmaking world, has been following for the past half a century or more. The person who declared Seven to be merely violent had gone to the cinema to be entertained, not challenged or forced to confront the darkest and most disturbing aspects of humanity, and having seen another serial killer movie which she had found funny in the past, she had perhaps even been expecting there to be some form of comic relief in this one as well. So instead of being affected in any significant way, she almost certainly dismissed the film entirely and went to find something more entertaining. And because the entertainment industry is an industry like any other, meaning that as such its primary purpose is to make money, movie and TV executives have always done their very best to reach the widest possible audience while, barring carefully orchestrated publicity stunts, causing the minimum possible level of controversy and offence. In fact, to quote part of a recent message from my good friend Luke Taylor, once again the link to his channel is listed down as the underbar, and I ask everyone to please subscribe to him, while Asian storytelling was thriving, evolving, developing and getting richer, American storytelling was being dulled down to not offend anyone, or set anyone off, or give anyone the wrong idea. We were so afraid of giving people the wrong idea that we didn't give them any ideas at all. As a matter of fact, I've literally lost count of the number of times during the last 2 years or so that I've seen a truly meaningful and emotional plot development in non-Asian movies and TV series, such as A Noble and Heroic Sacrifice, be rendered completely null and void, solely because the audience wants a happy ending and their beloved character back. For example, Groot in Guardians of the Galaxy. On top of that, it seems that 9 times out of 10 nowadays, a great threat or moral dilemma isn't actually a threat or dilemma because it's magically resolved just in time for the happy ending. After all, the new credo in non-Asian entertainment appears to be that nobody cares if it insults their intelligence and makes no sense whatsoever, as long as it looks pretty, makes them feel whatever they want to feel on command like Pavlov's dog, and everyone goes home happy. And although it's not guilty of any of these things in itself, even The Fault in Our Stars, a film about love in the face of terminal illness, in which death and tragedy were inevitable, was so sugar-coated as to be rendered almost entirely meaningless. Whereas in the last few days alone, watching one Asian movie a night, I've seen a film exploring the culture of silence surrounding suicide, and another exploring the long-term emotional, psychological and social consequences of rape, which at the very end, when we don't know whether the final message from the victim is a Dear John letter or a suicide note, asks both the rapist and the audience a deeply profound and challenging question before cutting straight to the credits and leaving us to ponder it.
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained? Is this not why you are here?
So in conclusion then, if all you want is to be entertained for however long the movie or TV show in question may last, then please go ahead, knock yourself out. Nobody is stopping you. However, please stop kidding yourself that it is honestly intended to be any kind of revealing insight into the human soul, because when you are profoundly moved or challenged or your life is changed by English language or European entertainment, for example, it's almost always because you projected something onto it, perceiving something which the studios and executives did everything in their power to minimise in order to avoid upsetting anyone, assuming that it ever even existed at all, meaning that in the end, because your reaction was almost certainly the result of your own experiences and your own mindset, please do not expect anyone, least of all me, to share that same reaction. Indeed, if you are new to my channel and wondering why I would waste 2 years of my life watching entertainment in which I have no real interest, when it's obvious that I greatly prefer Asian cinema, the first answer to that question is because I was being pestered around the clock by people who, in their desperate need for validation, insisted that the films and TV series which they loved were just as great, and that if only I would stop being such a racist, anti-American weeaboo or Koreaboo hipster, then I would be forced to admit how great English language entertainment can genuinely be. Because yes, for as long as I've been talking about Asian cinema here on YouTube, I've been told repeatedly, more often than I can remember, that I'm being a racist hipster, that I only like the films in question because I have yellow fever and want to fuck the actresses, yada yada yada, blah blah blah. Meaning that like the friendless, nerdy little school kid that I was around 25 years ago now, some part of me genuinely believed that if I watched what other people liked and maybe pretended to like it as well, then they would stop picking on me. But no matter how much I try to force myself to be normal, in inverted commas, the reality is that I am not. As I've hopefully explained in this video in tremendous detail, it is the fact that so much of Asian cinema directly and intentionally explores reality, challenging and questioning the viewer, which is the reason why I adore it so much, while, as I mentioned earlier, even when the creators are genuinely trying to deliver a profound emotional and social message, non-Asian cinema is usually so softened and watered down that any real impact is entirely subjective, meaning that some people's lives will be changed through watching it, while others will simply fall asleep. But in stark contrast to this though, whether you love it and it changes your life for the better, or you demand that every copy be burned along with its creator, nobody watches a Kim Ki-duk film, for example, without feeling some kind of deep emotional reaction. And if an American film were ever to show the same kind of balls as a Kim Ki-duk movie, then I would recommend it just as highly. To spell it out then for people like Harold Smith, who seem to make a career out of deliberately misinterpreting everything that I say, while there will always be exceptions to this rule, in general, the films which most people like are entertainments in which any real long-term social, emotional or psychological impact is entirely subjective and almost always unintentional, the result of the audience projecting what they want to see onto the experience itself, not the other way around, while the movies which I love, on the other hand, are almost always made for the express purpose of rattling our cages, challenging our smug, ignorant conceit, and slapping us in the face with cold, hard, brutal reality. Of course, as I will explain in my next video, no different from the people who accuse me of being a suicide-enabling paedophile, the people who accuse me of being a racist, anti-American hipster weeaboo or what have you, of only pretending to dislike the entertainment which they love, are only doing so because it fits their internal narrative. Because no different from the fiction that we watch on screen, we all create stories in our own minds to explain everything around us, happy little fairy tales in which we are always right and they are always wrong. So no, regardless of how much I struggle to explain or how much English language entertainment I may force myself to watch in the hopes of shutting them up, the people who insist that I only pretend to hate what they love for one reason or another will always continue to do so, simply because it's easier for them, because they want to, and because they can.